Is everything that we think we know about gut health wrong? Well, it's complicated. That is today's show with Dr. Brad Leech. Listening to the show live, you will know that we have brilliant partner offers to help you with your low-tox swaps. Enjoy these offers from Forest Superfoods and AusClimate. Brad, hello. How you doing?
I'm very well, Alex. Yourself?
I am great, and I am so thrilled to A, meet you, B, talk about what we are going to be talking about today, debunking a few things, broadening the mind on the understanding of gut health. When did gut health passion start for you as a practitioner? Or maybe it was even before.
You know, it's an interesting one here. I never wanted to get into gut health. I almost resented practitioners who are specialists in gut health, and I very much am in autoimmunity, but my initial desire in this health profession was autoimmunity, going through, different degrees and so forth. And when it came down to my PhD, I wanted to find the cure for autoimmune conditions, inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, you name it. And I stumbled across a paper by Dr. Vassano, who is an Italian researcher who theorized that we could stop the development and exacerbation of autoimmune diseases through a mechanism in the gut called increased intestinal permeability, also known as leaky gut. And I thought, that's what I'm going to focus on. And then after many years of a PhD and research, I've done this huge circle back to now focusing on the gut, but also gut autoimmune conditions, because we know that the microbiome, this integrity in the gut, it is paramount when it comes around to preventing the exacerbation of an autoimmune disease. And we can actually reduce the risk of further autoimmune conditions developing if we modulate the microbiome, if we modulate this barrier integrity. So it's very much an emphasis in my practice. Address the gut when it comes around to autoimmunity.
Okay. And you still see bandied about in various news outlets and, when they wheel out a doctor and they'll say, so-called leaky gut, and they'll put it in parenthesis, and you're just but no, it's a thing. We know this now. For you, if you think about all the science that we have, what tells you unequivocally as a PhD holding person that leaky gut is real?
Well, I've done an entire PhD on leaky gut. I mean, if it turns out not to be real, then I'll just
That'll
throw
kind
the
of
whole
suck.
PhD out the window. But it's how we describe it. So there is no such thing as leaky gut syndrome. Okay, leaky gut syndrome does not exist. And for some reason, we started referring to it as leaky gut syndrome about 15, 20 years ago. Now, if you look at that term, leaky gut syndrome alludes to that there's a group of clinical symptoms that cluster together, which can't indicate anything else but resembles something that the patient's presenting with. Irritable bowel syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome. It's not a diagnosis. What I have proposed in the literature is it's a mechanism within the gut. So increased intestinal permeability is this disassembling of the tight junctions within the small intestines. And we've actually debunked this concept that leaky gut has a set section of symptoms. There are no GI symptoms that all correlate to the presence of leaky gut. So we can't refer to it as a syndrome because there are no symptoms. And in fact, when you actually dive into the research, and we did this systematic review where we looked at over 22,000 articles. I spent the better part of 9 months reading these articles. It was a very dark time in my life. All I did was
You
read
made it.
articles.
You made it.
I made it. And as practitioners, we have this thought that leaky gut or intestinal permeability presents itself as digestive-related symptoms. But in fact, it doesn't present itself as digestive-related symptoms. There is no research to say bloating and constipation and indigestion are linked with intestinal permeability. There's been a few researchers who've tried to make that link, but it wasn't statistically significant. In fact, the presentation that resembles intestinal permeability more so are chronic disease states, inflammation, dyslipidemia, anthropometric measurements resembling obesity.
I'm going to need a dyslipidemia. Let's unpack that one quickly. I don't know what that is.
So elevations in high LDL cholesterol and low HDL cholesterol and high lipids, so that fat profile imbalance. hyperglycemia, so elevations in blood glucose, insulin resistance, overweight, obesity, and the consumption of a Western style diet. They are the driving factors that can resemble intestinal permeability.
Okay. Yep. Right. So what we're really looking at is a concept that then presents a whole bunch of different ways depending on the person, situation, stress levels, and I'd imagine a whole bunch of other factors.
The other one to note here is we looked at all of the conditions linked up with intestinal permeability, and they were autoimmune conditions, metabolic-like syndrome, irritable bowel syndrome, liver-related diseases. And what we found was the prevalence of intestinal permeability in a population of those with inflammatory bowel disease or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease was about 30%. So only 1 in 3 individuals who has these conditions linked up with intestinal permeability will actually have intestinal permeability at that given time. And that's why we need to look at these environmental factors that could drive up intestinal permeability. The biggest one is actually going to be stress. Stress is by far the greatest driving factor to intestinal permeability that I've seen. They did this really cool study recently where they measured participants, about 20 healthy individuals, for intestinal permeability. And then they asked them to give a 20-minute presentation and then measured their leaky gut thereafter. And it was statistically significant. There was this increase in permeability after giving a 20-minute presentation.
Wow. Yeah. And can I ask how they actually measured? Like, what did they do to test the before and after?
So this particular study utilized the lactulose mannitol ratio, which is basically where you drink a solution of a disaccharide and a monosaccharide sugar, so 2 different sugars, and you collect the urine. What I'll note here is the test, which is commonly available in Australia and in the world, utilizes a 6-hour collection window. The research out of New Zealand has actually confirmed that window is too long and it really needs to be between 2 and 4 hours. So I don't routinely utilize that test in clinical practice, purely because the length of urine collection is too long, but I'll utilize it in research settings where they actually have a shorter urine collection period of time.
Okay. And so, stress is just so huge. And I think this is where we really fall apart in our brilliant bubble of discussing these topics, when like the science and the passion and the knowledge that we have at the forefront of what really makes a difference is not reflected or being caught up to in any way by public policy around public health, low socioeconomic stress, cost of living stress, rental stress, like all the things. And it just kind of blows my mind. I feel like integrative health 2.0 is going to actually be about the integration of what we now know of integrative health and how we create public policy around things so that we stop having it be so privileged and expensive to get healthy.
But in saying that, there are many, many things that we can do that are free or cost effective when it comes around to supporting intestinal permeability, to supporting the microbiome, to supporting gut health. What I find is compliance. Compliance is a big one. And sometimes with patients, they look for a supplement. They're almost disappointed when I don't prescribe a supplement, when in fact, some of the greatest tools that we can do to modulate the environment in the gut are, and I like to say the different stages of digestion. And I say that the stages of digestion starts with the mind, the nose, the mouth, and then down. So the mind, in that sense of conscious eating, being present when you eat, not being stressed, being relaxed, doing deep breathing. Then it comes around to smell, actually smelling your food. Too often, people are getting fast food or they're not smelling the food. You know that saying of take time to smell the flowers. Take time to smell your food because that will stimulate digestive enzymes to start to be released. Yeah. From there, it's the mouth. Chewing. That is such a thing that we take for granted, is chewing. We want to be chewing every single mouthful 15, 20 times to really break it apart to support with digestion.
100%. Yeah, I completely hear your point, and I think it's really important that for most people, I totally get that. The compliance piece is, where's my silver bullet though? Make this easy for me. I'm busy. I guess I was talking more broadly about like big health stats and huge public health costs, and everyone always bitching about that. And why am I paying for someone to go to the hospital and all that kind of stuff? And it's like, well, if they could get fired for taking a loo break, let alone a lunch break, like that, these are big systemic problems. And that person doesn't have time to chew 20 times. And that's the reality for this huge group of people, which, when we were chatting before I hit record, I said that's not what we're here to focus on today. But I always want to appreciate how sometimes it's just not easy to even get your head around it. And I guess I've had experience with this with mold illness over the last decade. We've ended up in a rental loop because of how sick I got initially and how much that cost us by deposit 10 years ago. And then realizing how many buildings are sick. And, I've interviewed over 400 doctors now, Brad, so I know what needs to be done, but it's very hard to do it when everything is fighting against you. And so I have a very deep sensitivity, I think, for sometimes it just ain't easy, even if it's free. So my heart goes out to anyone who thinks, oh my God, I don't know if I could do it, because I really get it.
It's hard. It really is. My wonderful wife, she's partly done building biology and she's an architect. And
that is the best combo. I love to hear that. Yes.
So we've recently renovated our house. And it's interesting when, you've got to consider that these huge costs when it comes around to renovating a house, which is healthy, but also not blowing the budget. So, we know along the lines of these, and you'll know more about this, the coated wiring in the house to reduce the EMFs and reduce the electromagnetic fields. But they are expensive. To do a house all the way through would have cost an extra, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. The way we got around it to reduce that cost is we didn't put any PowerPoints in our bedroom. And we actually put a kill switch in our bedroom. So then any power that was coming in for, say lights and light switches, you'd kill it at the door, and you would have this reservoir in our bedroom where there wasn't these driving factors. But then other aspects around, having the windows in a situation where we can get the most amount of breeze through the house to help with that ventilation. Little things like that. My wife, she's amazing when it comes around to designing healthy homes.
So good. We need way more of them.
Yes.
It's a passion project of mine. And so stress you've mentioned, we've kind of now just touched on some of the building biology things. How much do genetics, and I guess you've mentioned food there, but let's talk about genetics for a second, because we're still hung up on the fact that genetics is so important and it's screwed if it's bad. And now we know about epigenetics and all of those environmental factors that we talked about. Are genetics a factor in leaky gut at all? Does the science tell us anything there?
Presented on that topic just last weekend.
How handy.
Yes, there are a few particular SNPs and genes which will increase the chances of having intestinal permeability. Those are going to be the celiac genes. So when you've got the celiac genes, the SNPs in and around the celiac genes, there's studies to show that those individuals can't tolerate gluten as well as others, and they have a greater response of intestinal permeability. So that is one component to consider.
Can I ask on that? That's the HLA-DR-DQ kind of family. So
yes.
There's research around toxin elimination with that particular group as well, right? So would this mean bringing the intestinal permeability in, that this group would be more likely to be allergic as people as well?
What I've seen clinically and what the research is indicating is those with those celiac genes, it's almost like their system's more heightened. So it's not just permeability, it's not just that increased odds of celiac disease, but there's multiple aspects, including detoxification, which are impacted. So most likely, yes.
Wow. Ooh.
The other one that I'll mention is the FUT2 gene. So that's FUT gene. And that has been linked up with changes in the microbiome. So reduced amount of bifidobacterium, and then thereby a greater odds of developing intestinal permeability.
And so when we think about healing guts and sealing guts, there's a bazillion dietary protocols going. And I often find people in our community, or they've joined our community and they're talking gut health. And then you see the comments and you think, oh my gosh, people are literally hopping around to the next protocol and the next protocol and the next protocol, but kind of not feeling like they're getting big results. They're feeling a bit lost. In your humble opinion, how are we best placed to approach when we just know something's up? Our guts aren't happy. Our whole health picture is just not seeming to improve no matter what we try. Where does someone start these days to really feel like they're not just buying hope, but they're actually moving forward in a constructive way for their health?
What I'd say here is finding the right practitioner. And that may be the right practitioner in the sense of somebody with that clinical experience, or maybe just someone that you resonate with. There is research to show that when you work with a practitioner, or when you're, more connected or on the same wavelength as the practitioner, there are greater health outcomes as a result. And we actually showed that in some of our research. Participants who actually worked with a practitioner had greater improvements in their gut health compared to not working with a practitioner. There are so many different trends out there. I get really concerned when I see supplements getting popped up on my social media saying, buy this high dose antimicrobial, whether it's berberine or oregano, and you read it and it almost sounds too good to be true. It's, fix the gut, heal the gut, weed out all of the pathogenic bacteria. But then you get concerned because they could be taken for too long or at too high of a dose, or you may not actually need them. In some patients, they need antimicrobials. In other patients, they actually don't. So it's about finding the right practitioner, but then finding and identifying what's actually happening, and whether that is through a really good clinical assessment. So that is, whether it's looking in the eyes, the tongue, and listening to the patient in the sense of what are they eating? What type of foods are they reacting to? What have they previously tried? What's worked? What hasn't worked? And if finances allow, yes, testing, whether it's microbiome testing, whether or not it's genetic testing, but finding what option's going to provide the best treatment direction.
You mentioned genetic testing there, and this is a bit of a little side quest question, but what are your thoughts on data privacy in the age of genetic testing?
There is a company.
Because I kind of deleted my whole 23andMe when I saw they went into administration. I was like, get out, just delete it all.
Yes. We've come a long way since genetic testing, 10, 15 years ago. A lot of the higher quality testing where they come at a greater cost, that greater cost is protecting your data. So there are particular labs that I would trust more so over others. When it comes around to my own data.
Okay, awesome. I'll pop a couple if anyone's really wanting to explore that in the show notes. And then back to what we were talking about. So you mentioned a really good clinical assessment. So you mentioned eyes, mouth, and then really discussing symptoms. Can you just go through exactly what we should hope to expect from a really thorough assessment? Because I often remind people, just remember you're the customer here. If you're not vibing, just keep shopping around. You don't have to stay with someone you think, nothing's really getting better, but they're qualified. So I'm sure they know more than me. And I just think I really agree with you and resonate with you there, Brad, because it's that patient-client person relationship is huge.
Yeah. You want to have that connection. So it really depends what the patient is presenting with. And let's just take GI, so gastrointestinal related symptoms, whether it's inflammatory bowel disease or whether it's just my guts don't feel right. I feel like I'm bloated. So you don't just go, oh, you've got bloating. Okay, great. Take fennel seeds. See me in 3 weeks' time. We want to understand, where is the bloating? Is the bloating higher up? Is it lower down? Is it within 30 minutes of eating, or is it 2 hours after eating? So that can give us an indication of whereabouts the bloating is occurring throughout the digestive system. Is it within the stomach, the upper part of the small intestines, or going further down? Are there particular foods that result in greater severity of bloating? Now, they may be FODMAPs, so your fermentable carbohydrates, and that may give us clues for SIBO and that small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. We'll also want to understand what makes it better. So what can you do for your gut symptoms to improve? And the one that I always look for is when patients, and I ask this question, when was the last time you went on holidays? Where did you go? And how's your gut symptoms? And they'll say, oh, I haven't been on holidays for a year, but yeah, a year ago we took a week off. We went camping on Gari and I had no symptoms. Straight away, I'm circling that going, okay, gut, brain connection here. So really understanding what can actually make their clinical symptoms worse. So going to work, kids screaming. So what makes it worse? What makes it better? The severity. Has this bloating started after a trip to Asia? So what can happen is you can develop a pathogenic infection over in Asia, and then it's referred to as post-infectious IBS, and it's quite prevalent, whereby you get loose bowel motions over in Asia, and then you come back and it kind of resolves, but you've got this lingering bloating. That can indicate that this pathogenic infection is A, still there, or B, has had a change to the ecosystem within the gut. So understanding that history of when did the bloating start. And another one that I really like to ask is, what have you previously tried? What supplements have you tried? What diets have you tried? To kind of gauge, well, if a low FODMAP diet didn't work for you, I'm probably not going to recommend a low FODMAP diet.
Yeah, so good. And I think I had a practitioner once, my first naturopath, who I think she started about the same time as Francesca Naish, like OG naturopaths in Sydney, and she had to move back to Germany. But I remember she would ask me so many questions. And it's only now that I know what I know that I think back to the kinds of questions she asked and I understand why she was asking them. But she would ask things to kind of rule stuff out. Or, does glycine make you sleepy the next day, not just help you sleep that night? And, eggs, how you feeling after cruciferous, super farty, bloaty, diarrhea, constipation, swapsies. And I just did not know what any of that meant. But what she was doing was basically helping me avoid a $500 gut test and get straight to the problem. And I think that's what you're saying if you've got really good diagnostics and scanning and a great practitioner, you can actually start working on stuff with your health dollar a lot sooner.
And something I say to patients, I go, I'm sorry for all the questions, but I'm basically in the next, like the first 30 minutes, like I know them better than their partners know them, in the sense of the nitty gritty.
I'll never forget my first naturopath. Yeah. I was like, I was just talking for an hour. That I'd never done that before and I couldn't believe it. But it's just like mining for clues, isn't it? Yeah. So good.
Making the links.
Exactly. And so we've mentioned a few different gut things there. You've mentioned pathogens, SIBO, and all of these things have kind of been grouped together with the refrain, chorus, whatever you want to call it, of weed, seed, and feed, like to cure what's going on. You're not such a huge fan of that saying, or practice, I would say, from doing my research.
So this is the thing to consider is, we as practitioners, we need to evolve with the science.
Yeah.
At one point in my career, I was weed, seed, and feeding my patients. Most patients that walked in my door, I was weed, seed, and feeding them. I would actually teach my students when I was lecturing to weed, seed, and feed. This is going back 8-10 years ago now. That was the philosophy, because that's what we understood when it comes around to how to treat the gut, how to address these bacteria. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work. Sometimes, you get patients messaging you saying, I'm having what they would refer to as a die-off. You shouldn't be having a die-off approach. So to give a bit of background here, seed feed is this concept it just kind of like came from a textbook 20 years ago, maybe 25, 30 years ago, where we use antimicrobials to kill the bad bacteria in the gut. So that's weed. And then we utilize probiotics to recolonize the gut. And then we utilize fiber and prebiotics to feed up those bacteria. Now, I've recently been debunking this concept of weed, seed, feed. And I came across these research articles back in, they came out around 2020. And I came across these articles at the end of 2021. And I was blown off my seat. I read these articles probably about 3 times. I'm like, this can't be right. Maybe it is right. And it almost, from that point, from around that 2022, I've drastically changed how I go about treating the gut and how I see patient success is huge in the sense of patients' compliance, patients' outcomes, and the changes that I see on, let's say, microbiome testing when you do a before and after test. So these two studies, what made them really unique here is for many years, we've had hundreds, maybe 1,000 research articles on the impact of antimicrobials on the microbiome. Hundreds, thousands. And they all show, common themes or sometimes conflicting evidence. But the issue that I had was the vast majority of the studies utilize culture and PCR as a way of measuring the microbiome. So they would get participants, they'd measure their microbiome before and after, they'd give whether it's oregano oil or berberine, and they'd measure for particular pathogens or pathobionts. And then they'd report in the study, yes, it's improved. The thing we need to consider with culture and PCR, which are two different types of technologies when it comes around to measuring the microbiome, is they're only selective. They only look for a handful of different bacteria. They don't look for all of the different bacteria in the gut. So before 2020, there was no research ever conducted utilizing something called metagenomic sequencing. So metagenomic sequencing is where we look at all of the species in the gut, all of these microbes, to collectively go, well, who's there and what are they doing? So these two studies are for the very, very first time, utilizing this advanced way of measuring the microbiome so we can actually see what impact does these antimicrobials have, not just on particular bacterial species, but on all the species. And I'm talking one of 28,000 different species. I'm talking about a lot of different species here. So these two studies, they were multi-centered, double-blind, randomized control trials with around that 300 to 400 patients with diabetes. And they utilized berberine. So berberine, it's an extract found in philodendron and golden seal. It's a frequently prescribed antimicrobial.
Well, it's often used for regulating blood sugar and things like that as well, promoted as a heart health supplement.
Yes. Remind me and I'll tell you about that heart health and berberine. So these particular studies, they took high-dose berberine, and I do need to express that. This study utilized high-dose berberine, 500, 600 milligrams twice a day. So higher than what practitioners would commonly use, but you can buy berberine at that dose over the counter here in Australia and online and in America. So it is at a dose that is accessible. And patients took berberine for around that 12 to 16 week mark. They measured the microbiome before and after. And then they basically will propose, well, this is what's happened. Interesting here. You would theorize, being an antimicrobial, it would reduce bad bacteria, right? What they actually found is supplementation with high dose berberine resulted in an increase in pathobionts and disease-associated species in the microbiome. So it actually increased E. coli, Klebsiellas within the microbiome. And it actually increased the species linked up with inflammatory bowel disease and IBS, right? That was just one part of the story.
And so that's only just 1,000 milligrams broken up into 2 doses. It's not even like crazy town. It's 2 capsules.
Yeah, it's 2 capsules. So that 500 to 600 milligrams twice a day increased these disease-associated species. And then it actually reduced the beneficial species. It reduced bifidobacterium. It reduced butyrate-producing species. It reduced our beneficial species and also microbial diversity. So
I can literally hear people tipping out their berberine bottles in the background as we speak. I'm imagining it all around the world because that is such a common blood sugar regulating heart health supplement, which I still want you to go into on that too.
And let me pose this question. We as health professionals, we have a duty of care, and that is first do no harm. That is first do no harm in the prescriptions that we give. I cannot deny that prescribing berberine has profound impact when it comes around to regulating blood sugar and cholesterol. It has a profound impact. It's a very potent and very effective intervention. But you know what? So is statins. Statins are great at reducing cholesterol. The thing we need to consider here is what are the other options as integrative practitioners that we have to regulate blood sugar and cholesterol? We have bitter melon, we have chromium, we have zinc, we have just changing up our macronutrients, we have increasing dietary fiber, increasing exercise. Why should we be utilizing golden bullet when it causes harm to some other aspect of our health?
100%. It's
So,
like
yeah.
I always talk about when we're making swaps, personal care, cleaning products, and some of them are grey area kind of safe still, especially in the greenwash category. And I'm like, well, if you've got the completely safe options, let's just do away with the grey area safe where it may or may not, when we know that there's a whole group of products now that for sure are super safe. So let's just stick to those. It feels like that's a parallel we can draw with a supplement like this. And it really speaks to this trend in biochemistry labs where if they can find a positive study result from a particular nutrient, boom, we're in business and we're making millions. I mean, a lot of people bag the pharmaceutical industry, and rightly so. There are many levels of heinous crimes and profiteering that have happened over the last century. However, we cannot ignore the fact that the nutraceutical industry, the wellness industry, is actually 3 times the size and will have just as many sharks and ambulance chasers in it as in the pharmaceutical industry, I'm afraid, folks. And I think we really just have to have our heads level. And that's one of the reasons really early on in Low Tox life that I thought I am only speaking to the best of the best, the least bought whenever we're talking about topics, because there's just so much sway out there, conventional or holistic.
And it's one of those things where, I've been to a pharmaceutical conference, once or twice, and it's next level. Everyone's there in black ties and bow ties and tuxedos. When it comes around to like a conference dinner, where you can compare it to like naturopathy. Everyone's there, in their eco,
in their
linen
flowy
shirt.
eco. It's a different vibe. Yeah, it's a different vibe. I totally know where I want to be as well. But I guess what I'm saying is I think it's really important that just because a supplement has or a nutrient has one positive study, we can't then just go, oh, great, that's my new silver bullet, because they found this in one study in a cohort of 80 people.
What I do want to just, reconfirm here, because I don't want anyone to have backlash around herbal medicine. Herbal medicine has been around for thousands of years. I'm traditionally trained in Ayurvedic medicine. Like it's part of the development of society. Now, I utilize antimicrobials every single week in clinical practice. Okay. But I utilize them in certain situations. I utilize them in particular dosages. I will utilize them in particular people, in particular individuals, and I'll utilize particular antimicrobial. So I may not be going for the high dose oregano oil or the high dose berberine extract, but I'll be utilizing antimicrobials such as garlic, crushed up garlic, great antimicrobial. I may utilize extract of pomegranate husk extracts, a more gentle form of antimicrobial. The other thing that I'll note here is these studies it's a research study in the sense of they prevented any confounding factors. So they weren't working with a naturopath, they weren't working with a nutritionist. They just took a high dose supplement. Within clinical practice and within society, that's not how it works.
No.
You don't just prescribe one intervention. So my observations here is if I had a patient who I prescribed berberine, I would be co-prescribing protective factors. I would be ensuring that they have a great diet diversity. I'd be working on, preventing them from snacking or eating particular foods like stewed apples or kiwi fruits at the same time to mitigate the negative impact that berberine may have, and then thereby not going to have such a drastic impact that we see within these studies. But these studies are highlighting what it could be if we don't protect the microbiome at the same time.
Yeah.
So we initially said weed, seed, feed. My perspective here is feed, feed, feed. So we really need to feed up the microbiome, whether it is with prebiotics or whether it's with diversity in the diet. The number one way that we can increase microbial diversity, so that's the number and type of bacteria in the gut, is diet diversity. Going down to the local farmer's market, growing it yourself, or even at the supermarket. I don't mind where you get your produce from, but try and consume something you didn't eat the week prior. Yeah, too often we fall into this habit, and we've got a newborn at the moment, and we're
I'd
in
imagine
almost
you've fallen into a few habits. Yeah, it happens to the best of
gone
us,
to this
Brad.
survival mode
Yeah, yeah.
where the sense of forget sitting down and eating as a family, that's probably only happened 3 times in the last 2 months. But we've fallen back into this terrible habit of just me quickly running to the supermarket and just grabbing what we had in the fridge the week prior and then cooking them up, whatever's quick, whatever's easy. But now, okay, we're past the hard part, maybe. And I want to now get back into going, well, let's get the asparagus, let's get the snow peas, let's do the foods which haven't been on the plate recently.
Yeah, such a good point. And thank you for being humble and letting us know that even PhD qualified naturopaths are finding it tricky sometimes at different points in life, because I think the sooner we all admit we're just not perfect, and sometimes you're up against it and you just can't do what you would ideally prefer to do. That is human, but it doesn't mean you throw it all out the window.
You do the best you can in the situations that you're in.
100%. And so feed, feed, and feed. Let's unpack that a bit, because I feel like that berberine example, and then you bringing us back to say, if I were to prescribe that, I would then be putting in some protective buffers. It sounds like your approach has evolved into a let's steer the gut in the right direction, rather than like a warlike mentality of like kill and then let's get things growing again. Is that sort of...
What I've found clinically is the best results I have when, changing patients' presentations and symptoms, markers of disease activity, whether it's blood markers, whether it's microbiome markers, is we spend 2 months feeding up the microbiome. We spend 2 months to really come in here with diversity, with, emphasizing particular foods. Oats. Oats are a superfood. And I know that they kind of went out of fashion and back in fashion and out of fashion. Whatever they are, I recommend oats on a almost daily basis because they contain resistant starch. They contain beta-glucans. But it also comes down to how we prepare the oats. So if we actually do overnight oats versus cooked oats in the morning, the overnight oats will have 2 to 3 times more resistant starch in them than cooking them in the morning. So doing simple methods like that, and overnight oats are very, very easy to do. It's a bowl, hot water, oats, put in the fridge, I'll see you tomorrow. You don't need to sit there on the stove for 10 minutes. So it's actually quite a speedy approach when it comes around to preparing breakfast. So oats are a great option. The other one, depending if they're in season, is going to be dragon fruit. I love dragon fruit for the microbiome. But even things like potatoes. Now, when I was young, in the sense of how old would I have been? Brother would have been about 9, so I would have been about 6. Okay, I come from a separated family where mum did everything that she could to feed us on a very restricted income. I'm talking we were in hand-me-down clothes, we were op shops where it is, and our food budget was minimal. We survived a lot on potatoes and onions, right? That was one of the staple dishes in our diet. Now, we got to think about potatoes. What my mother actually did was cook the potatoes in batches and then kind of give it to us, a day or two after. What she was doing without actually knowing was creating resistant starch. And so these potatoes, and they were just cheap white potatoes. Back then, I think it was like 50 cents a kilo. Cooking them and then cooling them, eating them the next day, increases the resistant starch. The resistant starch that, yes, you can take as a supplement, but it's found at a therapeutic dose in cooked and cooled potatoes. Side note here, newer research has come out that if you cook them, cool them, and reheat them, there's still resistant starch. So we no longer need to eat cold potatoes in winter.
I like grating a potato into a soup to give it like a nice starchy thickness. And then we eat that soup like as our quick lunch grab for like 3 or 4 days afterwards. So the reheat of that potato soup is now even more and more resistant over those few days.
Excellent.
Wow,
Yes, excellent.
cool. Okay. And so you've mentioned those feed elements of resistant starch. You can obviously, PHGG, partially hydrolyzed
Hydrolyzed guar
gum,
yes.
yes. Now, that's like a bit more of a trendy sort of, we're now kind of going into supplement territory. Why is that so loved right now? Is there something particularly special about it?
Practitioners love it for a number of different reasons. It's low reactivity, meaning that we can prescribe it and it doesn't have this reactive action that we see with other prebiotic fibers. So some prebiotic fibers, inulin and GOS, so that's galacto-oligosaccharides, they can have a reaction where the patient has bloating or changes in bowel motions, where PHGG, it's very safe. The other one is it's quite affordable. And when you're looking at supplements, there are some supplements that are almost $2 a dose. PHGG is quite an affordable supplement when you look at the diversity of different supplements available. So the affordability, the accessibility, you can buy PHGG in every health food store. You can buy it online. It's all produced by the one main supplier of PHGG. So it's kind of all the same product. So it's not like one PHGG is better than the other. It is all supplied by one big supplier. And then the last one is the ability of the patient to take it. When you mix PHGG with water, it dissolves. It doesn't turn thick and gluggy. It doesn't have a bad taste or an aftertaste. It's very easy to take. And so because of that, the popularity behind PHGG has skyrocketed because it's effective in that sense of supporting with bowel motions, supporting with butyrate production, feeding up the microbiome, but it ticks all the boxes of affordable and easy to access, and compliance is a great option.
Yeah, nice. And it has a gentle binding effect as well, doesn't it, compared to, say, eating a potato?
Eating a potato, I mean, in a sense, so a lot of fibers will have that binding effect, but it will be released when it gets down into the large intestines, where it will actually be utilized as a fuel source for the microbiome through a fermentation process.
Gotcha. And so feed, and we've talked about resistant starch. Is resistant starch, if we talk about, let's call it fungal issues, bacterial issues, and parasite issues as like the three usual kill kind of weed offenders, where does resistant starch fit in the old weed seed and feed? Like, how are they helping in that?
So when you say parasites and when you say fungal, are you referring to, let's say, Blastocystis and Candida?
Yeah, they're common ones that people would go to a practitioner and say, oh, I've got these things and I need to get them in check and bring the levels down or kill them or whatever. These are really common things that people have been doing.
And it comes down to misdiagnosis. Here's a stat for you. Out of I've probably done over 1,000 microbiome tests. I've only successfully identified Candida overgrowth in 2 individuals.
Wow. Hold on. How many have you done? Estimate?
Over 1,000.
2 people.
2 people. One patient was a 20-year-old young boy with severe inflammatory bowel disease who was in the midst of multiple experimental medications and ended up getting part of his bowel removed and was having about 20 bowel motions a day. He had Candida overgrowth. The second patient actually had a bag, so the intestines wasn't connected to the rectum and her fecal matter was coming out through the bag. So I know this has gone a different direction here, but you don't often see true Candida overgrowth in clinical practice. And I'm sorry if your practitioner is saying that you have Candida overgrowth, they're utilizing the wrong methods of identifying Candida. What a lot of assessment of Candida is done through culture. And that is where basically you put stool on an agar solution and you watch it grow. Candida loves growing in a nutrient-rich, oxygen-rich environment. Now, I have heard horror stories from friends of mine who work in laboratories where they get samples back from in the post and they crack open the sample and it's like this waft of green smoke coming out and it's like a forest in the sample. And this is because the sample got lost in the post or it didn't get back in time. That has got Candida overgrowth, most likely through cross-contamination with the vaginal microbiome as well, or the skin microbiome. So you do not often see candida overgrowth. If you think that you have candida overgrowth, I would say probably not. So that's one component. The next one here is when it comes around to parasites, blastocystis and D. fragilis. They are the two common parasites that people say, I've been had these identified through the GP. Now, I refer to this as identification bias. And identification bias is this concept where GPs, they utilize such a restricted test when it comes around to measuring the stool. And the identification bias is you have a symptom, we've measured your stool, you have D. fragilis, which is a common parasite, that's the cause. I'm going to prescribe antibiotics to kill it, right? That is this mindset of just because I've found something, that is now going to be the reason behind your symptoms. That's not always the case. The large associations for GPs came out August 2024 and said, stop prescribing antibiotics for D. fragilis, okay? Because D. fragilis is part of the ecosystem in your gut. Right? It is not the cause of your abdominal symptoms. It is not the cause of your problems. Same with blastocystis is there are over 50 different subtypes of blastocystis. Okay? 50 different subtypes. There is research to show that blastocystis is linked up with a healthier BMI. Blastocystis is linked up with a more diverse microbiome. My prediction here, and we are 20 years away from confirming or saying that this prediction is incorrect. But my prediction is there are 50 different subtypes. 1 or 2 of them are going to be problematic. The rest, they're going to be fine. Okay. What I do say when it comes around to addressing blastocystis and D. fragilis is it's about supporting the ecosystem in the gut. If you support the ecosystem in the gut, feed up this mucus barrier in the gut, then if they were having an issue, then they're not going to drive a problem anymore. So it's about supporting this ecosystem in the gut rather than trying to kill it. Because I have spoken to too many practitioners, and these are qualified practitioners, where they tell me, yes, I went to the GP, I had blastocystis, or they did a fancy gut test and they identified blastocystis or D. fragilis. They went on high-dose antimicrobials or antibiotics, they retested, and they still had it. And what have they done? They've just destroyed their gut in the meantime. So identification is real, and just because it's there doesn't mean it's the problem behind the symptoms you're presenting with.
Wow, that's huge. I feel like we've now entered Brad's 3-day seminar where I now want to ask you like 300 questions about all of it and get to the bottom of everything. A question I will ask at this point, though, is, so what about the people who find resistant starch constipating, or the people who have been told because you're a midlife woman, you need to go low carb now, or because, for whatever reason, people trying to lose weight? It can really feel quite, I've had so many conversations with people who almost feel like their mindset isn't right going into trying to improve their resistant starch intake because they're fearing it and what it's going to do to them. But if there's a very real physical reaction to it, like a girlfriend of mine said, I tried that whole cold potato thing and my stomach felt like, what did she say? She felt like I'd just loaded it up with bricks for 3 days. Is it a go slow and easy and build very, very intentionally over time for it to actually have the benefit versus like a shock effect?
No. So
okay.
I don't prescribe resistant starch in any form, whether it's diet-wise or supplement-wise, until I either understand their microbiome or have done an assessment of their clinical presentation, because within your microbiome, you can have something called a methanogen. So methanogen, also known as smithii, it's a methane-producing microbe. Now, this methane-producing microbe will utilize 2 things as a fuel source: resistant starch and inulin. And when it produces methane, it slows down transit time, causing constipation. So if you develop constipation after increasing resistant starch, the odds are there could be a methanogen overgrowth, and we actually want to bring down the methanogen overgrowth before we start utilizing resistant starch. In that case, I wouldn't utilize resistant starch. I would utilize other prebiotic fibers such as pectin, beta-glucans, which are found in kiwi fruit and oats, so cooked oats, not overnight oats, to feed up the microbiome without almost promoting these methanogens, which will actually cause greater constipation. So that's one component. So if you've got constipation, we need to understand, are there methanogens? The other one here is with all prebiotic fibers, low and slow. If you go increasing a high amount, you're going to get bloated. You may get constipated. You may have diarrhea, starting with a very, very small amount. And I have patients who say, I can't tolerate legumes and lentils. I'm like, okay, can you tolerate one French lentil? They look at me and they go, yeah, of course. Can you tolerate two? Yeah, sure. Can you tolerate a teaspoon? Oh, maybe. Then great, let's start off with a teaspoon. I have multiple patients under my care at the moment where they're taking a teaspoon of French lentils every day. The practicality, it's quite a difficult process, but what we're doing is we're slowly building up their tolerance to these fermentable carbohydrates by slowly increasing. And it can actually take 3 to 6 months until they can sit down and eat a bowl of dal.
Yeah. Can I share a fun tip there? You can actually load up from cooked lentils, put it in your ice cube tray, and that way you can pop out like a little tiny bit from the freezer to put, through a mashed potato or, well, not mashed potato in this case, but let's call it your soup that you're having for lunch or anything. And then that way you don't have to kind of let the can go bad if you're using a can, or the batch go off if you made a batch fresh. That when my pediatrician, well, not my pediatrician, my son's pediatrician, Layla, wanted us to increase our legumes for microbiome diversity, I was thinking, God, how am I going to do this without wasting food? Because we were really intolerant to them at the time, and that was how we did it. So just in case anyone wanted a tip there, just throwing it in.
That's a great suggestion, and one that, yes, I've frequently tell patients, because, you've got a can. Like, if you're only having a teaspoon, it can probably last maybe 2 days, 3 days in the fridge. It depends. If the whole family can tolerate it, great. Give them a lot of it because they're going to feed up their microbiome, and you just have a small amount. Or, as you suggested, ice trays in the freezer.
Yeah.
I want to address the other question that you had about carbs. Carbs. Don't want to get into a debate over the carnivore diet, the vegan diet, because, that's a podcast in itself.
Yes, it is.
When it comes around to carbs, it is a very real thing, okay? But does the individual have insulin resistance? Do they have systemic inflammation, which is driving up their inability to correctly metabolize these carbohydrates? So that's one component. Do we need to increase chromium-rich foods? Do we need to increase zinc-rich foods to support with that insulin resistance? Even things like, we can help to mitigate the glycemic response to food by eating our fats and protein first, and then consuming our more carbohydrate-rich food. So rather than going for the sweet potato chippies before we eat our salmon, we eat the salmon first and then the sweet potato chippies. In some situations where, there's a clear indication that we need to feed up the microbiome, but the patient just can't tolerate any forms of carbohydrates, grains, that's when I come in with a prebiotic fibers in a supplement form, whether it's PHGG, whether it's even resistant starch in a supplement form. Low dose is a way that we can keep the carbohydrate level low while actually feeding up the microbiome.
That is such a great tip, Brad, because I feel like in the low carb trend, while it may have served a purpose, while it definitely serves a purpose in midlife women where the hormones go bonkers and all of a sudden insulin's an issue and you never had that issue before, where you're trying to work on your long game and you need an SOS. I completely get all of that. But at the same, and diabetes, we could go on. At the same time, you don't want to lose your diversity. That's a pretty big price to pay.
So it's about, making sure that we can feed our microbiome. The other option here are going to be your polyphenols. So polyphenols are the colorful components in fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, herbs and spices, and they have a great impact on the microbiome. So if you're going low carb, choose, the highest quality extra virgin olive oil as a way to increase polyphenols, or, going for the colorful components, leaving the skin on, because that's where the highest amount of polyphenols are actually going to be to actually feed up the microbiome.
That's another great tip. Brad, do you ever fall off the food wagon? And if you do, what's like that one thing that sometimes you just crack for? Like just every now and then at a party, it's there, it's a little sausage roll, or is it like, tell us, you're a real person, right? Just like even once or twice a year.
No, okay, yes.
And just so you don't feel bad about whatever you say, one doctor once said Diet Red Bull. I'm just going to leave that with you.
So I grew up in a very health conscious family. I'm talking, all of the trends. We did the juice fast around, the New Year period. We had what was that? The acid alkaline balance diet.
Oh,
All of
yeah.
those trends growing
I
up.
did the grapefruits only until midday with my mum once as a
Yes,
teenager.
all
Yeah.
that. So I very much grew up very health conscious. To this day, I've never had a can of Coke. I have never
Wow.
had McDonald's. I don't crave McDonald's because, well, I've never had it. I've never had a sausage roll. I've never had
You've
processed
never
ham
had a
meat.
sausage roll?
No, no,
Gosh.
never.
Okay.
Never a fan of Bunnings. But the one thing I do love, and if ever anyone wants to, just get on my good side, it's a almond croissant. I love,
Okay. I
and
knew there would be
I'm almost,
something.
whenever I go to a local farmer's market, I'm like, okay, where's the almond croissant? And I'll buy an almond croissant maybe once a month. That would be my treat, and I absolutely love it. So yes, I do love an almond croissant.
And I love that, like, because whenever I ask this question, people literally light up about that little thing that they do every now and then. And I think that is key. I remember interviewing a brilliant intuitive nutritionist from the States. She was 70 and she'd always taught this way of it's how you bring yourself to the food if you are going to have something that we know is technically less than ideal. Just go with the joy, go with the enjoyment and just chill.
And you know what? I have said that to multiple patients because I also love coffee, and there's nothing wrong with coffee. Time, place, circumstance, and everything in between, which will govern, coffee. But there was this lovely, lady. She was about 65, a patient of mine, and she goes, "Brad, my partner and I, we have this ritual. If we go down to the bakery on a Sunday, and that's our treat, and we'll have a coffee, and we'll have a pastry. Can I still please do that?" I'm like, yes, I want you to do it. When you do it, enjoy it. Have no guilt around sitting down and enjoying that, something that brings you joy, because something that brings you joy and happiness will actually stimulate the vagus nerve. Stimulating the vagus nerve will produce more digestive secretions and you're able to digest it. So yes, I'm a huge supporter of that.
Nice. And almond croissants. Keeping small business in business. Love it. Brad, I could honestly talk to you for another hour. I feel like this is definitely one of those ones where there's going to be a part 2 in a few months for sure. Thank you for all that you do to work with clinicians to keep them up to date on the science, but also with your own patient care and advocacy. We really appreciate you and your work, and it was a joy to have you on the show.
Alex, always a privilege and an honor to be chatting with you. I've thoroughly enjoyed today.
Thank you. I hope you loved today's show as much as I loved bringing it to you. I want to remind you that if you are someone who craves a low tox community that is judgment free, full of empowerment, has health professionals and building health professionals that can support you, as well as me in there answering questions multiple times a week, I want to invite you to join the Low Tox Club. For the price of less than a cup of coffee a month, you have an annual membership for $49 Australian, so it's about $30 US or euro, that allows you to have a member masterclass every single month with a health professional or global expert from the podcast, where we have them to ourselves for an hour to ask questions and deep dive further. You have the beautiful supportive chat group. You have Q&As with me answering questions. We read books and talk about them, and a whole bunch more. You can head to lowtoxlife.com, hit the explore tab, and join the club is the very first option on that list. Of course, we have over 10 evergreen courses that you can jump into anytime, whether it's navigating everyday low tox swaps with our Go Low Tox signature course, whether you have kids and you're wanting to know how to best support them with our Low Tox Kids course, whether you're planning a family and looking at a healthy low tox preconception journey, reducing inflammation, especially the chronic kind, with our Inflammation Ninja course, many other courses. You can again head to lowtoxlife.com, hit the courses tab, and you'll see all of the options, which includes a business course, my Low Tox Method program. A lot of people don't know, but I was doing a lot before starting Low Tox Life in 2009, and I was a business consultant across hospitality, health, retail, and cosmetics, I have been in business consulting for a very long time. So I absolutely adore helping people move into the low tox space or develop their low tox businesses. So that's a way I can support you. And then, of course, there's our wonderful social media communities at Low Tox Life on Instagram, and of course, the website with over 250 gluten-free recipes, blogs, downloadable PDFs to help you navigate wanting to get rid of synthetic fragrances in your school or office. I could go on. So head to lowtoxlife.com, see what takes your interest or fancy, and thank you so much for being a part of our podcast community. I love, love, love reading your reviews. I appreciate every follow and subscribe. And I want to just remind you to finish off that if there's anything you heard that you found interesting from a medical or scientific perspective, it is intended as education only. Please always chat to a health professional who knows you and your situation best. I'll see you next week. Bye.